Finally, we get to the Editor tab, and this tab here is going to allow you to control how your hair is going to be displayed in the editor. First, you have a drop-down, and this drop-down is going to allow you to define what part of the hair object is being displayed. So if we select None, you'll see that nothing changes in the viewport, and that's because when you have the hair object selected, you're always going to see your guides. If we deselect the hair object, you'll see nothing is displayed at all. Selecting the hair object again, we can go back to the display and choose Guidelines. Again, nothing really changes at this point because when you're in the hair object itself, you always get the guides. As soon as we click out though, you'll see that the hair guides are still visible. The next option is the Guide Polygons. And what this will do is draw a strip of polygons that follows along the guide hairs. And so again, you can't really see too much happening right here, but if we get closer, you can see that there are actually polygon strips attached to the object now. And if we deselect the hair, you'll see that they are still staying in the viewport. After the guide polygons, the next option is hair lines. And when you choose hair lines, what you're going to get is a rough representation of your actual hairs that will be added to the object. Now the number of hairs that are being displayed can be controlled by the detail slider here. And what this percentage is controlling is the count in the hairs tab. So if we click on the hairs tab and take a look at count, you'll see it's set to 4,000. So if we go back to the editor tab, the detail is giving us 5% of those 4,000 hairs we should see. Now we can take the detail all the way up to 100% and we'll get all those 4,000 hairs. You can see that the feedback here with 4,000 hairs is actually really smooth still. If you're working with more hairs, say 40,000 or 300,000 even, you really might want to roll back this detail here. The final option is hair polygons. So just like with the guide polygons that draws a polygon strip along the guide, the hair polygons is going to draw the same sort of strip but along your hair. You'll also notice that the hair polygons take on the shape of the hair itself. So this view here gives you a really great idea of how you're actually going to see the hair when it's rendered. And you also get the added bonus that there is some shading on this. You can see as we move the editor camera, you do get a bit of feedback on the shading of your hair. And if we increase the detail, you'll see that it does move slower, but you do get a good preview of the lighting on your hair. Next we have some options here that are going to allow you to help optimize your viewport settings for the hair. The first is cache, and what cache does is more or less store a state of the hair so that it can fetch that back later on. This will generally help speed up the display, but it is going to use more memory. The next one is show back facing, and it's enabled by default. And this means that even if a hair or one of these strips is facing away from the camera, it's still going to show in view. If we disable show back facing, any hairs that are pointing away from the camera will not be drawn. The next option that we have is simple shaded. And just like in your display options, you have the Garou shading and the quick shading, and then constant shading. So you have these different ways of looking at the light falling across your geometry. So the simple shaded checkbox is more or less the same thing. With this unchecked, we get a preview of the highlights on the hair. Checking simple shaded is just going to display the color of the hair. And this should also really help to speed up the viewport performance. The next section that we have is Generate. And what this dropdown is going to allow us to control is how these hair polygons are being created. So if we get down nice and close and take a look at them, you'll see that they are all perfectly flat. By default, this is set to as render, and as render is going to reference back to whatever settings you set in the Generate tab here. So if you're planning on editing anything in the Generate tab, make sure that this is set to as render so that you get a good preview in the viewport. Next we have an option for None, and this should really display nothing as it shouldn't be generating anything for the viewport. Next we have Flat, and that draws all of the hairs as simple, flat objects. You'll also see that they don't really point towards the camera like they did with the as render. We have an option for Try, and this is going to give the hairs a triangular base. So if we get to someplace close to where we can rotate around here, You can see that we have a nice triangular base to all of those hairs. Finally, there is box, which is pretty much the same as try, except this time the profile of the hair is a square shape rather than a triangle shape. With generate set to box, we can actually go to the display menu here and set this to grow shading lines. And now it's going to actually draw all of the geometry for the hairs as well. So you can see that it is actually creating a fair amount of geometry here just by all of the lines that you can see. Now in the editor you have a level of detail option. And so by working with this level of detail option here, you can control how Cinema's level of detail options here are going to affect your hairs. So taking a look at these, we have options for none, all, count, or segments. Starting with none, if we go to display and set the level of detail to low, you'll see that the display does not change at all, so it does not affect the hairs at all. If we set this to all, you'll see that it instantly jumps. You'll also notice that we don't have as many segments going along the hair, and there are definitely not as many hairs in the scene. If we go to the display and change this back to high, you'll see that we get that dense population of hair again, with lots of segments along each hair. Going back to the level of detail, we can choose count. If we go to the display again, find level of detail and set this to low, you'll see that the number of hairs has decreased, but the divisions along the hair has remained the same. Finally, you have segments, which is the exact same thing, except this time it controls the divisions along the hair, but it doesn't affect the count. Finally, there's an as render checkbox, and if our level of detail is set to all, and then we can go back to the display and set this to high again, the as render checkbox is going to look at the settings that we see here in the hairs tab to control the count of hairs and the number of segments along these hairs. If we go back to the editor tab and uncheck as render, it's then going to use the count settings that you can see here and the number of segments that can be found here to draw